All right. Hey, folks. So today I want to talk to you about progressive overload and two ways in which you might be screwing up your gains. So firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength physique goals, there's a link in the description. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about what is progressive overload. Yeah. So progressive overload is this idea that over time, you are going to be getting stronger. And as a result, you'll provide a continuing amount of tension onto your muscles, which will mean that you'll get bigger. So it's a very common concept. The idea being that, okay, if you can bench a plate aside for 10 now, when you get to the point where you can bench 3 plates aside for 10, you'll be that much bigger and stronger. And that is a perfectly logical statement and perfectly true. No one would deny that. And the implication is that if you just add a little bit of weight to the bar per time, and that's all you need to do to get bigger and stronger. And there's a lot of truth in that as well, but I want to talk today about a couple of ways in which people mess that up and something that you might be doing and you might be unaware of in your quest for more weight in the bar. So that's progressive overload. Now, secondly, let's just quickly sort of briefly touch on my notes here. How a muscle grows. The idea is that muscles, the main driver for muscle growth is mechanical tension. So if you place a particular type and duration of tension on the muscles, then they will recover and then they will grow. So it has to be a particular type of stress, and that stress is usually in the 60% of 1 rep max range to 100% range. Usually, most people would agree about 60 to 85 is reasonable. Provide that stress and you provide it for enough repetitions, enough duration, basically. So you put the muscle under as much stress as like X number of sets and reps. The usual recommendation is at least 10 sets per week. So the idea is with progressive overload, if you just adapt to that workout, you carry on adding a little bit of weight to the bar every time, and you'll go from that plate aside bench to the 3 plate aside bench. Now, I remember when I first got into bodybuilding and I came from powerlifting. Because obviously in for you powerlifters out there, you know what I'm describing. I'm describing linear periodization. And linear periodization, as most people know, has a fairly short half-life, as it were, in that you can get so far, and you guys have probably heard my stories of linear periodization, how I got to a 90-kilo bench and like a 170 squat and a whatever it was deadlift, and I stalled out. Yeah, and to get stronger, I needed to make some changes. I had to introduce some sort of more complicated periodization. My favorite was block periodization, and I started to work in 3-week waves where I would do 2 weeks of heavy training followed by a deload, and I would just go. You guys have heard the story before. So linear periodization got me only so far, and I remember the community of people online that I was in at the time. I remember saying to those guys, because they were all trained with linear periodization, and I said to those guys, "Hey, you know, I'm done." And it was a bodybuilding community, right? I said, look, I can't get any stronger. So how do I get stronger? And they said, well, no, Faz, you've maxed out your potential. Like you only got the potential for a 90-kilo bench because, well, they didn't know any better. They just said, well, you're doing everything right. You know, your diet's fine. You're training, the linear periodization. You're adding weight to the bar. I guess you're done. So me sat there with a 90-kilo bench at like, I don't know, 22 years old. I was like, oh, well, this sucks. But obviously I didn't listen, and I went and learned more effective ways. And not only did I get stronger, but I also got bigger. And that brought me to the whole sort of world of deloads, periodization, concurrent training, conjugate training. And I did a lot of it to eventually get stronger. Perhaps not the traditional version of conjugate training that you guys are used to, but I did have elements of conjugate in my training to get to my strongest. So anyway, that was my experience coming from powerlifting. Bodybuilders would tell me, well, you just eat, sleep, and you just add weight to the bar every week. And I was like, what? Is it that simple for you guys? I mean, I'm over here, you know, like struggling like hell to get to I don't know. When I got into powerlifting, I'd just about done a 150 bench, 150 kilo bench, a 230 squat, and like a 250 deadlift or whatever it was, right? So I was like decently advanced, but. So these powerlifters, these bodybuilders told me, look, you just, you rest up, you eat a lot of food and you add weight to the bar and it just kind of happens. It's like, oh, all right. Because like I tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work very well. It got me and they were like, well, that's how you do it. That's bodybuilding. And I was like, well, what about like And I tried a bunch of, like, what about, I used to do heavy singles. Like, no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to ego lift. Leave your ego at the door, bro. And just a whole bunch of stuff. So that was my experience of bodybuilding coming from a powerlifting. It was a very confusing thing because no one was talking about mixing it up. They just said progressive overload is the way to do it. Get stronger, add a bit of weight to the bar. And I'm like, dude, I stalled out on that 10 years ago. But okay, if that's the way to do it, then I guess that's the way to do it. So that's generally how a muscle grows, is mechanical tension. Now, with linear periodization, the idea is that I keep adding weights to the bar. Now, how it's usually used in bodybuilding these days, in the modern sense, it's something that people normally do about 8 to 14, sets. The top set, back off set thing is quite popular. It's basically just linear periodization. People have like push-pull leg splits, upper-lower splits. You'll notice that all the programs that I sell, the full body routine, the strength routine, and the upper body specialization, none of them use linear periodization. I don't. While I've not out and out said anything negative about linear periodization, like it'll only get you so far. But basically, that's what we're describing. We're describing progressive overload, linear periodization. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, while I know that progressive overload has a broader meaning, like it just means getting stronger over time, I get that. But how it's used in the modern context is essentially linear periodization. So if we can agree on that, just for the sake of my argument, let's move on. So next, what does progressive overload demonstrate? So if you are capable of adding more weight, it shows that whatever you did in your previous few weeks, it worked. So if you reach a plateau and you can't replicate the same performance with more weight or more repetitions, it means you've reached a plateau. It means you have adapted and you're not able to adapt any further. Okay, so let's just have that premise, because I'm setting up for the demonstration of why people screw it up. So if, let's say, for example, you go from 1 week to the next, you add some more weight to the bar, but you cannot duplicate the performance with more weight or by doing more repetitions with the same form, it means you've stalled out. Okay, should bear that in mind. Next. So yes, basically, progressive overload is the epitome of linear periodization. So where people go wrong? Where people go wrong is once they've hit that plateau that I described, that they have added some weight to the bar and they are no longer able to demonstrate the same form as the previous week for the same number of repetitions or for more reps or for more weight. What they tend to do is, because they don't know any other ways of doing things, they tend to shorten their range of motion. Now, the effect of that is they're not demonstrating that they've gotten any better. So yes, you've gone from 100 kilos in the bench for 8, to 102.5 kilos for 8. However, to accomplish that weight, you've shortened the range of motion. Yeah. Now, that's a problem because you're violating the laws of linear periodization. Basically, linear periodization states you do more by duplicating the form from the previous week. If you just make the form easier, you've not demonstrated you've gotten any better. You probably could have done that last week if you just shorten the range of motion. So now here's where we have a bit of an issue, and we start to cloud the problem. We cloud the issue because partial ranges of motion, if taken to the extreme, like really short, and I have seen that happen, it's easier in my experience to gain strength in shorter ranges of motion, but you don't get the corresponding muscle size with that strength. That's a big problem. So we have two problems here. One, by shortening the range of motion from week 1 to week 2, you've clearly demonstrated that you've not improved and you've plateaued. Okay, that's the first thing. Yes, of course, you might have had a bad week, your dog died or whatever, but in general, you've hit a plateau. You guys know what I'm talking about. So you've demonstrated you've hit a plateau, but in your mind, you're still progressing because you've shortened the range of motion. Or let's say, for example, you've just got more pop off the chest, or your spotters helped you, it's like really obvious things like that. And then it gets further clouded by the fact that when you do train in a shorter range of motion, then it's easier to gain strength without the corresponding size. That becomes a secondary problem. So we're now in this topsy-turvy world where, okay, we've demonstrated we've definitely not gotten any bigger. And also, our training has now become inefficient, so we're definitely not going to get bigger and stronger, even though we might get get bigger, even though we might get a little bit stronger. So now we're in dangerous territory because not only have we hit a plateau, but also that plateau has meant that we've reduced the range of motion and therefore we're just not going to progress particularly well thereafter. And if we also might be insistent on using the same exercise over and over, which could lead to overuse injuries and sore shoulders and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the first way people go wrong, is once they don't realize they've hit a plateau and they carry on and they continue to bust through that weight plateau by reducing the range of motion continuously until they're just not lifting very much at all. And that exacerbates the problem. It's a 1-2 punch. Now, the next thing is people move to lower rep ranges. So I know quite a few people in the sort of the amateur bodybuilding community, like, like non-competitors and coaches or whatever, people who lift in the whole progressive overload stance, who work with very low rep ranges. Like they'll work with something like if you see them train, their top set will be something like 3 reps with a partial range of motion, and then a further 3, maybe force reps. Now, you bear in mind what I said in the previous slide about partial ranges of motion and how they're not as good for hypertrophy, and it basically means you've stalled out somewhere. If you then move to lower rep ranges, again, in my experience, it's far easier to gain strength without the corresponding muscle size if you're only doing a 3-rep max. Like, you can get quite strong for quite a while just hammering out 3-rep maxes, 2-rep maxes, 1-rep max, and then a few force reps afterwards. So we've got another problem here, and you see how these two things combine, where some guys who you see in the gym, the progressive overload advocates, they end up being very, very strong, but they don't have the corresponding muscle development. You look at them when they're stripped off and you go, what, that guy can, partial deadlift 220 for reps? Really? He doesn't look like in a tracksuit. He doesn't even look like he trains. You wouldn't really know he trains unless he told you, hey, I'm a coach or whatever. Like, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but you know what I'm saying. So you have this issue where people, the progressive overload crowd, and I realize I'm using a broad umbrella here, but the problem is you start to get into those plateaus, you reduce the range of motion, you reduce the repetitions, you're getting to the point where you're heavily utilizing force repetitions as part of your 6 reps. And then you're never really growing. All you're doing is demonstrating that your training unequivocally does not work. That's what you're demonstrating. In your mind, it's like, great, progressive overload, progressive overload, progressive overload. And you'll see with these guys, they typically have 2 types of clients, or like these, they typically come in 2 types of camps. They're either not very advanced or they're on drugs. Because even with this style of training, if you take enough drugs, it'll work. So that style of training can't be trusted for those reasons. And I see it all the time. I see guys who train like this, and the only reason they're actually getting bigger and stronger is because of the drugs. If a natural train like this, they would hit a plateau hard and fast. And as a result, they would start to get sore and beat up. I mean, maybe you could get moderately, far with this. Like I stalled at a 90-kilo bench. Some of you might still think that's pretty decent, right? But in the grand scheme of things, it was far below. I eventually doubled that, right? So yeah, some of these guys might get reasonably far, but it's not going to be anything actually impressive because this type of thing is allowed to happen. So solutions. So just a bit of a summary here. If you insist on not using a full range of motion and working in very low rep ranges for all your standard exercises and you call yourself a bodybuilder, you're fooling yourself, basically. So solutions. Now, if you're solely interested in muscle size, you might be able to get away without the strength work. So, because essentially, those guys are basically training like a strength athlete. They're just doing very, very high intensity work. And so they're getting a lot of strength gains, but very little hypertrophy. So, I remember when I was really into powerlifting, I kind of did both. So I would do singles regularly. I've gotten away from singles in the last probably 8 to 9 years, but, well, something like that. I've gotten away from them at least in the last 5 years. But, there are advantages for strength work. So I'm saying, with the partial range 3-rep max type of work, it's fine for strength. But then if you're not backing that up with the work which is going to actually build your muscle, like the maybe the moderate rep ranges rather than the lower rep ranges, maybe the fuller range of motion rather than a short range of motion, perhaps you're not getting the best of both worlds. So if you're solely interested in muscle alone, instead of doing that type of training, which is low rep partial training, you might just completely change it around for moderate to high repetition, full range of motion training. Now, depending on your genetic potential, prudent use of both techniques may yield the best results. So, like, just to give you a bit of example, the video's dragging on a little bit. When I made some of my best gains, I was doing heavy singles alongside repetition work. And later on in my powerlifting days, I was actually doing speed work as well. I didn't call it speed work at the time, but I was doing, and you'll see that in my tactician booklet, which is a strength training program, and is what I used when I was at my strongest. So, but if you're a bodybuilder and all you're doing is employing just the strength style stuff, like that is particularly ineffective. So what you want to do then is, if you insist on doing that work, back it up with work which is in a moderate to high rep range with a fuller range of motion, effectively moving more towards a conjugate style of training or concurrent or whatever you want to call it. So that stuff works. And not everybody has the ligament structure. Yeah, not everybody has the sort of the ligament structure or the nervous system empowerment to really be able to just do muscular work. Like, as a bodybuilder, you might need to do the single repetition work and the really sort of like heavy high rep stuff to get strong. But what you definitely need is the moderate rep range stuff with the fuller range of motion for good clean reps, you know. Yeah, so hopefully that has given you guys some food for thought. Like, if you're a bodybuilder and that's your only sole purpose, definitely don't just do low rep partial range of motion stuff. That's a no-no. Now, if you're a bodybuilder, you might just be able to get away with high repetition, you know, decent range of motion stuff. However, depending on your genetic potential, your makeup, like me, for example, I've told you guys before, I wasn't particularly gifted when I first started. But what did eventually get me to the point where I was a lot stronger was I trained my nervous system. I trained my nervous system and I trained my ligament structure to be able to handle heavier loads. So I did the singles, alongside the repetition work, but I did do the singles, and that got me, pretty much my biggest ever. The photos you see of me in contest shape were really just refining the physique that I built in my powerlifting days. I didn't add any muscle tissue, although I looked bigger. I was a full 35 pounds lighter than in my powerlifting days. So I was only 80 kilos on stage. So anyway, guys, I will call it there. Hopefully that's given you something to think about on this lovely Sunday. Take it easy. Let me know what you think, and I'll speak to you next time.